January 10th, 1862. Hartford, Connecticut. A man dies of gout at 47 years old, leaving behind $15 million. His 3-year-old son stands in the parlor of a mansion so vast it required an entire hillside. 10 days later, the child's infant sister dies. 7 months after that, his mother gives birth to a stillborn baby. Within 2 years, his final sister, aged 3, will also be dead. 4 children, gone. But the mansion remains. Armsmear. The name means Meadow of Arms. It sits on a hill in Hartford, Connecticut, overlooking the Connecticut River. From its tower windows you can see for miles. Below, where the land flattens into marshland, stands a factory, a massive, sprawling complex with a distinctive blue onion-shaped dome. And beneath that dome, hundreds of machines turn, revolvers, thousands of them. The mansion watches. It watched when Samuel Colt built a 2-mile dike to hold back the river. It watched when German workers arrived to live in houses designed to look like their homeland. It watched when the armory caught fire in 1864, possibly set by Confederate sympathizers, and the blue dome crashed through the ceiling while the widow stood weeping. It watches still. Today, Armsmear is a retirement home for elderly women. The greenhouse where Colt kept exotic orchids is gone. The deer park, the fountains, the lagoons, all replaced by a public park, but the mansion itself remains painted pale pink, its Italian villa architecture softened by time. Inside, 51 women live in apartments carved from ballrooms. They pass through hallways where Colt once entertained senators and generals. They climb stairs his children never got to grow old enough to use. The children are buried elsewhere now. Colt had them interred on the mansion grounds initially, in a copse of weeping willows he called the Grove of Graves. But his widow moved them in 1894. Perhaps the mansion had seen enough death. This is not a story about innovation. It's not a story about American ingenuity or the pioneering spirit of the Gilded Age. Those stories have been told. Museums celebrate them, tour guides recite them. Colt is remembered as a genius, the man who perfected the revolver, pioneered mass production, and built a model factory with libraries and social halls for his workers. But every fortune conceals a cost, and every mansion casts a shadow. Samuel Colt's factory ran 10-hour days in an era when 14-hour shifts were common. He paid relatively high wages. He built housing for workers. He hired a band to play music during lunch breaks. By the standards of 1860s industrial capitalism, he was progressive, benevolent even. And yet, his workers struck multiple times in 1901, 1912, 1915, 1916, 1918. The International Association of Machinists organized them. They demanded recognition. They demanded control over their own pace of work. They demanded to be treated as more than interchangeable parts in Colt's machines. The mansion watched those strikes too. Here is what we know. Colt died with a net worth equivalent to $472 million today. His widow, Elizabeth, managed the company for 43 years after his death. She supervised the rebuilding of the armory. She navigated labor unrest. She outlived all 5 of her children. Here's what the museums don't tell you. 4 of those children died before the age of 3. 1 drowned at sea at 35. The Grove of Graves wasn't poetic imagery. It was literal. A burial ground for infants built on the lawn of a mansion that cost millions while workers in the valley below earned $2.50 a day. This is the story of Armsmear, a mansion that overlooked an empire built on firearms, a fortune that couldn't save 4 children, a legacy that museums carefully curate, emphasizing innovation while quietly erasing the strikes, the injuries, the men who lost fingers to machines, the women who replaced striking workers for lower pay. The mansion still stands on its hill. The factory still dominates the skyline below, its blue dome restored and gleaming. Between them runs Wethersfield Avenue, where Colt's funeral procession passed in 1862, 1,500 workers marching in pairs, forming an honor line from house to grave. They were mourning their employer. But what did the mansion see that day? What did it know about the cost of empire that the workers didn't? And why, after more than a century, does no one ask? Samuel Colt understood one thing before most men of his era: scarcity creates value, but ubiquity creates empires. Born in Hartford in 1814, he was the son of a failed businessman and a mother who died of tuberculosis when he was 6. His childhood was marked by instability. At 11, he was sent to work on a farm in Glastonbury, where he did chores and attended school. 2 of his sisters died young. Another would die by suicide. His brother John would be convicted of murder in 1841 and die by suicide the day he was scheduled to be executed. This was the soil from which Samuel Colt grew. At 15, he went to sea. Aboard the brig Corvo, bound for London and Calcutta, he watched the ship's wheel turn. Some accounts say it was the capstan. Either way, the mechanism fascinated him. A rotating cylinder that could be locked into position again and again, always returning to the same alignment. He carved a wooden model of a pistol with a rotating chamber. The idea was simple: a gun that could fire multiple shots without reloading. Revolvers existed before Colt, but they were expensive, unreliable, and impractical. Colt didn't invent the concept. He perfected the execution. In 1836, at age 22, he received 2 U.S. patents for his design. He raised capital from his father and other investors and opened the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company in Paterson, New Jersey. The early revolvers, later called Colt-Patersons, were innovative but flawed. The company failed. Colt was forced to shut down operations in 1842. For 5 years, he pursued other ventures: underwater telegraph cables with Samuel Morse, waterproof ammunition. He demonstrated underwater detonators to Congress. None brought the success he craved. Then came the Mexican-American War. In 1847, Captain Samuel Walker of the Texas Rangers contacted Colt. Walker needed a powerful sidearm, something more reliable than the Paterson model, but based on the same revolving principle. Colt collaborated with him to design what became known as the Colt-Walker revolver. The U.S. Ordnance Department ordered 1,000 units. Colt had no factory. He turned to Eli Whitney, Jr., son of the cotton gin inventor, who manufactured the order at his Connecticut facility. The contract was completed by mid-1847. Colt was back in business. This time, he would not fail. By 1855, Samuel Colt had enough capital to incorporate his own company, Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company. He needed land, lots of it. He turned his attention to Hartford's South Meadows, a swampy, flood-prone lowland along the Connecticut River. Hartford's business elite thought he was insane. The South Meadows flooded every spring. The land was worthless. Building there was a fool's errand. Colt retorted, "Had any of the Hartford wise ones been to Holland?" He knew something they didn't. Swampland was cheap, and cheap land, if properly managed, could generate extraordinary returns. He began buying parcels in 1851. By 1853, he owned 250 acres. The land cost him relatively little. The dike, 2 miles long, 70 feet wide at the base, cost $125,000, twice the price of the land itself. But it worked. In 1854, the Great Flood of Hartford devastated much of the city. 66 hours of driving rain combined with spring snowmelt sent the Connecticut River surging over its banks. Buildings flooded, homes were destroyed. Colt's dike held. His detractors, who had mocked his folly in buying swampland, fell silent. Colt had not only protected his investment, he had proven that with enough capital and engineering, nature itself could be controlled. By August 1855, the dike and armory were complete. The factory was a marvel. Brownstone construction, gas lighting, indoor plumbing, a massive 250 horsepower steam engine with a flywheel 30 feet in diameter, driving 400 machines through a labyrinth of shafts and belts. Colt adapted the system of interchangeable parts, pioneered by Simeon North and Eli Whitney, to perfection. 80% of his gun-making was done by machine alone. The factory could produce 150 finished revolvers per day. Colt didn't just build a factory. He built a fiefdom. He called it Coltsville. Worker housing. 20 small tenements and 10 three-story houses along Highshope and Van Block Avenues, a social hall called Charter Oak Hall, filled with games, newspapers, books and periodicals, a library, a brass band, a beer garden, and most ambitiously, an entire village for German craftsmen, Potsdam Village, designed to replicate their homeland. In 1858, Colt noticed that the willows he'd planted to stabilize the dike were flourishing. He saw opportunity. He recruited German furniture makers from Potsdam and built them Swiss-style cottages identical to their old commune. He even imported folk music instruments and built a beer hall to ease their transition. The Colt Willow Ware Manufacturing Company opened in 1859. By 1863, it employed over 100 workers, producing wicker furniture sold across the United States, Cuba, and South America. Everything Colt touched seemed to turn to gold. He established a 10-hour workday when competitors imposed 14-hour shifts. He installed washing stations in the factory. He mandated a 1-hour lunch break. He hired instructors to teach workers to play musical instruments, hoping to form an armory band. In an era when factory owners claimed long hours were a moral good, preventing idleness and vice, Colt insisted that workers deserved leisure. Historians would later call him a paternalistic employer, progressive for his time. But there was another side to this benevolence. Colt fired workers for tardiness. He fired them for shoddy work. He fired them for suggesting improvements to the revolver design. He controlled the pace of production through contracts with outside manufacturers, setting minimum quotas and pay levels. Contractors who pushed their employees too hard were discharged from their relationship with Colt, not out of compassion, but because overworked employees produced inferior products. Control, not kindness, was the organizing principle. Colt's workforce was diverse by the standards of the time. He recruited European immigrants, Germans, Irish, English. He brought in skilled machinists from across New England. His factory became a training ground for toolmakers and engineers who would go on to found their own firms. Francis Pratt and Amos Whitney, Pratt and Whitney, Henry Leland, Cadillac and Lincoln, Edward Bullard Sr. They learned at Colt's expense and then they left. But Colt didn't need loyalty. He needed production. By the late 1850s, Colt's factory was supplying firearms to both sides of the Crimean War. He opened a plant in London in 1853, becoming the first American manufacturer to establish a European factory. He presented engraved revolvers to British officials. He displayed his weapons at the Great Exhibition of 1851 at Hyde Park, where he famously disassembled 10 guns and reassembled 10 guns, using different parts from different guns, demonstrating the revolutionary concept of interchangeable parts. The world took notice. Orders poured in. By 1857, Colt was producing 250 guns per day. His net worth soared. He became one of America's first industrial tycoons, a man who measured his fortune as a fraction of the nation's gross national product. Success, however, did not bring peace. On June 5, 1856, Colt married Elizabeth Hart Jarvis, the 30-year-old daughter of an Episcopal minister from Old Saybrook. The wedding was lavish, almost grotesque in its excess. The ceremony took place aboard the steamboat Washington Irving, which Colt chartered for the occasion. The boat departed from Brendendale Dock, passing directly in front of the armory. Colt's workers fired rifle salutes from the factory's blue dome as the vessel steamed downriver to Middletown. Fireworks, champagne, senators and generals in attendance. It was a spectacle befitting a man who had conquered nature, industry and competition. The couple honeymooned in Europe for 6 months, collecting art and antiquities. They returned to Hartford in December 1856, but their new home, Armsmear, was not yet ready. Construction had begun in 1855, designed by local architect Octavius Jordan. Some accounts credit factory engineer H.A.G. Pomeroy. The mansion was styled as an Italian villa with Moorish elements, featuring 3 towers, an elaborate OG dome, matching the factory's blue dome, and eventually 2,600 feet of glass conservatories inspired by London's Crystal Palace. They moved in June 1857. From the mansion's tower, Colt could see everything, the factory below. the willow-lined dike stretching along the river, the worker housing, the German village, the Connecticut River itself bending around his empire. He had built a kingdom on a swamp, but kingdoms demand heirs. On November 24, 1858, Elizabeth gave birth to their second child, Caldwell Hart Colt. He was named after Samuel's mother, Sarah Caldwell, and Elizabeth's middle name. Their first child, William Jarvis Colt, had died in infancy the previous year. One child dead, one alive. The mansion began to fill with ghosts before it ever filled with family. Colt continued to expand. He diversified. He established the Hartford Gas Company in 1849 and the Hartford Water Works in 1853, utilities that served his factory but also the entire city. He purchased a brickyard across the river in East Hartford and operated a private ferry to transport materials. His land holdings stretched from Willis Street to Wyoming Avenue down to the river, 300 acres, an industrial campus unlike anything America had seen. And atop it all, Armsmear watched. The mansion was not just a home, it was a statement, a monument, a physical manifestation of what one man could achieve through ruthlessness, innovation, and the exploitation of opportunity. But here is what the mansion knew even then. Empires are fragile. Fortunes are temporary, and no amount of wealth can protect you from the one thing that cannot be controlled: loss. Meet Michael Brennan. We don't know much about him. History didn't record his story the way it recorded Samuel Colt's. But we know he existed. We know he worked at the Colt Armory. And we know that in the spring of 1860, he stood on the factory floor surrounded by machines that could produce 1,500 revolvers per week. Michael was one of approximately 1,500 workers at the armory by 1862. He likely earned between $1.50 and $2.50 per day, depending on his skill level. Unskilled laborers made less. Skilled machinists made more. But even at the high end, Michael's annual income would have been around $780, assuming he worked 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. It would take Michael Brennan 19,230 years of labor to earn what Samuel Colt was worth when he died. This is not a judgment. It is a fact. And it is the foundation upon which Armsmear was built. Michael's workday began at 6 a.m., 10 hours of labor with a 1-hour lunch break. By the standards of 1860s industrial capitalism, this was generous. Many factories imposed 12 or 14-hour days. Colt believed workers deserved leisure, not out of altruism, but because exhausted workers made mistakes. Mistakes damaged machinery cost money. So Colt gave them 10 hours and called it progress. Inside the factory, the noise was relentless. Machines stamping, grinding, cutting. Metal on metal, the air thick with oil and smoke. The 250 horsepower steam engine driving hundreds of machines through a network of shafts and belts overhead. One wrong move, a hand slipping, a tool dropped, could mean crushed fingers, severed limbs, death. By 1900, industrial accidents killed 35,000 workers per year in the United States and maimed 500,000 others. Colt's factory, by all accounts, was safer than most, but safer than most still meant men were injured, still meant some went home missing fingers, still meant families received no compensation when accidents occurred. Michael Brennan stood at his station and worked. Around him, the factory hummed with precision. Interchangeable parts, every cylinder identical, every barrel measured to exact specifications. Colt had perfected the system. He could disassemble 10 guns and reassemble 10 guns using parts from different weapons, a feat that astonished European manufacturers when he demonstrated it in London. But interchangeable parts had a consequence. They made workers interchangeable too. Skilled craftsmen who once controlled the pace and organization of their work found themselves reduced to machine tenders. The work required less artistry, less judgment, less autonomy, and with less skill required, workers could be replaced more easily. This was the genius of mass production, and it was the violence of mass production. Colt didn't invent this system, but he perfected it. He understood that control over labor was as important as control over machinery. He hired and fired at will. He broke strikes not with violence, but with strategy. When the International Association of Machinists tried to organize in the early 1900s, Colt's successors, he died in 1862, joined the Hartford Manufacturers Association to combat the union. When male workers struck, the company hired women to replace them. Women could be paid less. The unions didn't allow women members. Problem solved. Colt's progressive policies, libraries, social halls, bands, housing, were not gifts. They were investments in worker retention and productivity. Charter Oak Hall, built in 1856, was described as probably the first social center erected by an employer in the United States. Colt filled it with games, books, newspapers, and periodicals. He hosted fairs, art exhibitions, musicals, and theatrical performances. Why? Because workers with access to leisure were less likely to drink excessively, less likely to agitate, less likely to organize. Recreation was riot control. Michael Brennan might have attended concerts at Charter Oak Hall. He might have checked out books from the factory library. He might have played in the Armory band if he had musical talent. But when his shift ended at 5 p.m., he walked past the factory gates and looked up at the hill. Armsmear. The mansion sat there pale and elegant, surrounded by deer parks and lagoons and greenhouses filled with orchids. From the factory floor, it looked impossibly distant. Not just physically, but existentially. It existed in a different world. Inside that mansion, Samuel Colt dined on imported delicacies served on silver platters. He entertained governors and senators. He commissioned art for the Wadsworth Athenaeum. His wife wore gowns that cost more than Michael's annual wages. Their son Caldwell played in rooms larger than the tenement houses Colt built for workers. And from the mansion's tower, Colt could look down and see the entire factory complex. He could see men like Michael entering and leaving through the gates. He could count them if he wanted. 1,500 of them by 1862. Did he ever think of them as individuals? Or were they, like the parts they assembled, interchangeable? We know Colt was strict. We know he fired workers for tardiness, for shoddy work, for insubordination. We know he rejected suggestions for improvements to the Revolver design, even when those suggestions came from talented employees like Rollin White, who proposed a breakthrough innovation in 1852, boring the cylinder through to accept metallic cartridges, only to be rejected and fired. White would later patent the idea himself and license it to Smith & Wesson, costing Colt millions in lost revenue. Historians call it the major blunder of Sam Colt's professional life. But it reveals something deeper: Colt's inability to see workers as anything other than subordinates. White wasn't a collaborator. He was an employee. And employees didn't innovate, they executed. This was the culture of the factory. Michael Brennan worked. He took his wages. He went home to one of Colt's tenement houses on Highshope Avenue. He might have had a wife, children, a life beyond the factory floor. But history doesn't record those details. History records production numbers, revenue figures, patent filings, the names of senators who attended Colt's dinner parties, the cost of the dike, the dimensions of the factory. It does not record Michael Brennan's hopes, his injuries, his exhaustion. It does not record the names of workers who died in accidents, or the ones who contracted lung diseases from years of breathing metal dust and oil fumes, or the ones who went blind from detailed machining work under gaslighting. Those names were not preserved, but Colt's legacy was. By 1860, Colt's factory was producing firearms faster than any other armory in the world. The company supplied weapons to both sides of the Crimean War. It sold guns to the U.S. military, law enforcement, civilians, and foreign governments. The Revolver became synonymous with American expansion, carried by Texas Rangers, cavalry units, settlers heading west. Colt marketed his weapons as tools of civilization, instruments of order, the great equalizer. But every revolver began as raw metal on Michael Brennan's workbench. Here is what the factory was: a machine for converting human labor into profit. Colt invested in the machinery. He invested in the buildings. He invested in the dike and the utilities and the worker housing. But he did not invest in the workers themselves. When Michael grew too old to work, there was no pension. When he was injured, there was no compensation. When he died, the company did not pay for his funeral. His family received nothing, and the mansion on the hill barely noticed. In popular culture, Colt's factory was celebrated as a marvel of American industry. Visitors toured the facility, journalists wrote glowing profiles. Colt was hailed as a visionary, a man who brought jobs and prosperity to Hartford. And in many ways he did. Hartford's population grew. The city's economy boomed. Colt's utilities, gas and water, benefited everyone, not just the factory. His dike protected the South Meadows from flooding, enabling further development. But prosperity is not the same as justice, and progress is not the same as equity. Colt's workers knew this. Even if they didn't articulate it in those terms, they felt it. They saw the disparity. They understood that their labor enriched Colt while they struggled to feed their families on $2.50 a day. So they organized. The first major strike came in 1901, nearly 40 years after Colt's death. The company was now run by Colt's successors, but the culture he established remained. Workers demanded a 9-hour day with 10 hours pay. The International Association of Machinists led the effort. The Hartford Manufacturers Association mobilized to crush the union. They succeeded in getting the reduced hours, but refused to recognize the union. And when the union continued to press, the company hired women to replace striking men. It was Colt's logic perfected. If workers are interchangeable, replace them. Strikes followed in 1912, 1915, 1916, and 1918. Each time, workers demanded the same things: recognition, control over the pace of work, fair wages, dignity. Each time, the company resisted. Michael Brennan, if he lived long enough, might have participated in those strikes. Or his children might have. The Brennan family, if they stayed in Hartford, if they survived the poverty and industrial accidents and diseases, might have carried the fight forward. But we don't know, because history didn't preserve their story. What we do know is this: the mansion watched. It watched as workers marched through the factory gates in protest. It watched as women crossed picket lines to take jobs at lower wages. It watched as the Hartford Manufacturers Association met to strategize against labor organizers. It watched, silent and indifferent from its hill. And inside the mansion, by the early 1900s, Elizabeth Colt lived alone. Her husband had been dead for 43 years. All 5 of her children were gone. The ballrooms where she once hosted Hartford's elite now echoed with emptiness. She had outlived everyone, and she had managed the company through it all. When the armory burned in 1864, possibly arson by Confederate sympathizers, Elizabeth supervised the reconstruction. She made the new building fireproof. She recreated the Blue Onion Dome. She ensured the company survived. She was ruthless. Not in the way Samuel had been, loud, promotional, aggressive, but in a quieter, more calculating way. She hired well. She watched the bottom line. She steered the company into the 20th century, navigating strikes and technological changes and market shifts. And she did it all from the mansion on the hill. The workers in the valley below built revolvers. Elizabeth Colt built a legacy. But whose legacy? Michael Brennan, if he existed, if he was real, left no mansion, no museum bears his name, no parks commemorate his labor. His contribution to American industry is invisible. And yet without him, and the 1,500 others like him, there would be no Colt's patent firearms manufacturing company. No revolvers, no empire, no Armsmear. The factory floor was the foundation. The mansion was the monument. And monuments, by definition, erase as much as they celebrate. Let's talk about what visitors are told. When you visit Coltsville today, now a National Historic Landmark District and part of a developing National Historical Park, you learn about innovation. You learn about Samuel Colt's genius. You learn about interchangeable parts and mass production and the Revolver that won the West. You see the Blue Onion Dome, restored and gleaming. You hear about Charter Oak Hall and the libraries and the progressive 10-hour workday. You hear about Elizabeth Colt's philanthropy, how she donated 140 acres to create Hartford's Colt Park, how she founded the Union for Homework to help working mothers, how she organized Connecticut's first suffragette convention. You hear about tragedy, 4 children dead, a widow left to manage an empire. What you don't hear is this. The mansion was completed in 1857. The conservatories, 2,600 feet of glass greenhouses inspired by London's Crystal Palace, were added in 1861 to 1862. They cost a fortune. Exotic orchids, fountains, temperature-controlled environments for plants that couldn't survive Connecticut winters. In 1861, while Colt was building greenhouses for flowers, the average factory worker in America earned $600 per year. It would take an average worker 25 years to earn the cost of those greenhouses. But here's what the museums quietly omit. Colt's first child, William Jarvis Colt, died in infancy in 1857. The same year, the family moved into Armsmear. Their third child, Elizabeth Jarvis Colt, was born next, but the records are unclear about her exact birth year. She died at age 3 in 1863. Their fourth child, Henrietta Selden Colt, was born in 1861. And in January 1862, both Samuel Colt and baby Henrietta fell terribly ill. Samuel died on January 10, 1862, at age 47. Cause of death: complications from gout. Henrietta died 10 days later. January 20th, 1862, she was barely 2 months old. Elizabeth Colt was 3 months pregnant at the time of her husband's death. In July 1862, she gave birth to her 5th child, stillborn. And then in 1863, her daughter Elizabeth, the 3-year-old who had survived infancy, also died. 4 children, dead in the span of 6 years. Only Caldwell, born in 1858, survived childhood. He would live to age 35 before drowning at sea in 1894, when his yacht, the Dauntless, went down off the coast of Florida. Elizabeth Colt outlived all 5 of her children. Now, child mortality was common in the 1860s. Infant mortality rates in urban areas were around 150 deaths per 1,000 live births. Disease, malnutrition, poor sanitation, these were the realities of the era. But the Colts weren't poor. They had access to the best medical care available. They lived in a mansion with indoor plumbing and gas lighting. They could afford clean water, nutritious food, and private physicians. And still 4 children died. This raises a question: what was happening inside Armsmear? Were the deaths purely medical? Or was there something about the mansion itself, the environment, the stress, the isolation, that contributed? We don't know. What we do know is that Elizabeth Colt commissioned a private burial ground on the estate. The Grove of Graves, a copse of weeping willows near the artificial lake. Samuel and the children were buried there initially. Imagine that. A family cemetery, on the lawn of your home, where you can see the graves from your bedroom window. Elizabeth lived in that house for 43 years after Samuel died. She raised Caldwell there. She managed the company from there. She hosted charity events and suffragette meetings and art exhibitions. And every day she walked past the graves. In 1894, she had Samuel and 4 children exhumed and reinterred at Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford. Perhaps the proximity had become unbearable. Perhaps she wanted them to rest in consecrated ground. Perhaps she was preparing for her own death and wanted the family together in a public cemetery. Or perhaps the mansion had become a mausoleum and she needed to escape. But the mansion doesn't give up its secrets easily. Here's another one. On February 4th, 1864, the Colt Armory burned. The fire started in the East Armory, beneath the Blue Onion Dome. It spread rapidly. The building was filled with gunpowder, ammunition, and flammable materials. Firefighters struggled to contain it. The heat was so intense that the Iron Dome, the symbol of Colt's empire, softened and collapsed through the ceiling of the armory. Elizabeth Colt, stood outside and wept. 900 workers were thrown out of work overnight. The loss was estimated at nearly $2 million, equivalent to tens of millions today. The official cause of the fire was never conclusively determined, but rumors circulated, whispers. Some said it was arson. Confederate sympathizers angry that Colt's factory was supplying the Union Army during the Civil War. There was no trial, no arrests, no investigation that produced definitive answers. But Elizabeth Colt believed it was arson. She had insured the building shortly after Samuel's death, an unusual move at the time. Whether she anticipated sabotage or simply understood the risk of running a factory filled with explosives, we don't know. But she was prepared. She supervised the reconstruction. She made the new building fireproof. She recreated the blue onion dome, identical to the original. And she ensured that production resumed as quickly as possible. 900 workers needed their jobs. The Union Army needed guns, and Elizabeth Colt needed to prove that the company would survive without Samuel. But here's the question no one asks. Who benefited from the fire? Not the workers. They lost wages during the shutdown. Not the Union Army. They lost a critical supplier temporarily. Not Elizabeth. She lost millions in property and had to invest heavily in reconstruction. So who? Confederate sympathizers, if the arson theory is true, but there's another possibility. Competitors. Colt's factory dominated the firearms industry in the 1860s. The company held critical patents. It controlled much of the market, and Samuel Colt had been notoriously aggressive in defending his intellectual property. He sued competitors. He blocked innovation that threatened his monopoly. What if the fire wasn't about politics? What if it was about business? We'll never know. But the mansion knows. It watched the fire, it watched the dome collapse. It watched Elizabeth Colt's tears. And it watched as she rebuilt stronger, more determined, more ruthless than her husband had ever been. Because that's the secret museums don't tell. Elizabeth Colt wasn't just a grieving widow managing her late husband's legacy. She was a capitalist, a strategist, a woman who understood that sentimentality had no place in business. She fired workers who didn't meet quotas. She hired women to replace striking men. She navigated labor unrest, market shifts, and technological changes with cold precision. And she did it all while living in a house haunted by 4 dead children. The mansion became her fortress. From its tower she could see the factory. She could monitor production. She could watch workers entering and leaving through the gates. She could ensure that the empire Samuel built didn't crumble in her hands. But she couldn't escape the graves. Even after she moved the bodies to Cedar Hill Cemetery, the mansion remembered. The grove of graves remained, an empty patch of ground near the lake marked by weeping willows. Visitors to Armsmear in the 1870s and 1880s would have walked past that spot. Would they have known what it was? Would anyone have told them? Or was it, like so much else, quietly erased from the official story? Here's what else gets erased. The workers who died in industrial accidents. We don't have their names, we don't have exact numbers, but we know it happened. By 1900, 35,000 workers per year died in industrial accidents nationwide. Colt's factory, with its hundreds of machines and thousands of workers, would have contributed to that toll. But there are no memorials, no plaques, no museum exhibits acknowledging the human cost of mass production. There's a memorial to Samuel Colt, a church, the Church of the Good Shepherd, commissioned by Elizabeth in 1867. The architecture features guns and gunsmithing tools sculpted in marble, a monument to his life as an arms maker. And in 1896, Elizabeth added a parish house as a memorial to Caldwell after he drowned. Monuments for the Colt family, none for the workers. This is not an accident, it's a choice. History is written by those with the power to commission memorials, endow museums, and shape narratives. Elizabeth Colt had that power. She donated land for Colt Park. She donated art to the Wadsworth Athenaeum. She endowed charitable organizations. And in doing so, she controlled how the Colt legacy would be remembered. The official story emphasizes innovation, philanthropy, and tragedy. It positions Samuel as a visionary and Elizabeth as a devoted widow who carried on his work. It does not emphasize exploitation. It does not dwell on labor strikes. It does not name the workers who lost fingers, eyesight, or lives to the machines. It does not ask uncomfortable questions about child mortality among the wealthy, or whether the stress of managing an industrial empire contributed to the deaths of 4 children. It does not question whether building greenhouses of orchids while workers earn $600 per year might be considered obscene. These are not the stories museums tell, but the mansion remembers. It remembers the grove of graves. It remembers the fire. It remembers the strikes. It remembers Elizabeth Colt sitting in the tower, watching the factory, calculating profit margins while surrounded by the ghosts of her children. And it remembers this: empires are built on secrets. What we celebrate is often less important than what we erase. And Armsmear, beautiful, elegant, carefully curated, is a monument to both. After the fire, after the deaths, after the graves, Elizabeth Colt lived. She lived for 43 more years, alone in a mansion built for a family that never fully materialized. Caldwell was there, of course, her only surviving child. But he was a boy when his father died, and by the time he reached adulthood, he wanted nothing to do with the factory. Caldwell Hart Colt was educated at Yale Scientific School. In 1879, at age 21, he designed his first firearm, the Colt double-barrel hammer rifle. It's now considered one of the rarest Colt firearms. Only about 40 units were ever made, mostly for Caldwell and his associates. He was elected vice president of the company in 1888 at age 29. He served for 2 years, but his heart wasn't in it. Caldwell loved sailing. He owned 5 yachts over his lifetime. In 1881, he purchased the Dauntless, a 121-foot champion racer. He averaged 10 months per year at sea. He toured Europe and the West Indies. He was vice commodore of the New York Yacht Club in 1888 and commodore of the Larchmont Yacht Club. He was, in other words, living the life of a Gilded Age heir, indulgent, aimless, and expensive. Elizabeth managed the company. Caldwell managed to avoid responsibility. Inside Armsmear, life settled into a strange rhythm. The mansion was enormous, too large for 2 people. The ballrooms Elizabeth had filled with Hartford's elite in the 1850s and 1860s now echoed with emptiness. The greenhouses still bloomed with exotic plants, but there were no children to marvel at them. Elizabeth filled her days with work. She wasn't the president of Colt's patent firearms manufacturing company. Her brother, Richard Jarvis, held that title officially. But everyone knew she was the power behind the throne. She made decisions. She hired and fired executives. She approved contracts and production quotas. And she rebuilt. After the 1864 fire, she didn't just reconstruct the East Armory. She made it better. Fireproof materials, improved safety measures. The Blue Onion Dome was recreated exactly as before, a symbol of defiance. If saboteurs or fate had tried to destroy Colt's empire, they had failed. The company thrived under her management. During the Civil War, Colt's factory supplied the Union Army with thousands of revolvers. After the war, demand continued. The American West was being settled, or more accurately, violently colonized. And settlers, cavalry units, and law enforcement all needed guns. Colt revolvers became synonymous with the frontier. But inside the mansion, Elizabeth's life was anything but adventurous. She attended charity events. She hosted suffragette meetings. Connecticut's first suffragette convention in 1869 was organized by Elizabeth Colt. She served as president of the Union for Homework for 22 years, an organization that provided daycare for the children of working mothers. She donated art to the Wadsworth Athenaeum. She funded the construction of the Church of the Good Shepherd in 1867 as a memorial to Samuel and their 3 deceased children. The church's architecture is extraordinary. Guns and gunsmithing tools sculpted in marble, a permanent reminder that the Colt fortune was built on weapons. In 1896, after Caldwell drowned, she added a parish house to the church in his memory. She was, by all accounts, the First Lady of Hartford. But what does it mean to be the First Lady of a city built on firearms? What does it mean to donate parks and fund charities with money earned from instruments of death? Elizabeth Colt never answered those questions publicly. Perhaps she never asked them privately. Or perhaps she asked them every day in the quiet moments inside Armsmear, surrounded by memories of children who never grew old enough to inherit the empire. We don't know. What we do know is that by the 1890s, Elizabeth was in her 60s, Caldwell was in his 30s. The company was profitable. The mansion was maintained. The legacy was secure. And then, on January 21st, 1894, Caldwell Hart Colt drowned at sea. His yacht, the Dauntless, went down off the coast of Florida near Punta Gorda. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Historians have proposed theories: navigational error, rough seas, acute health failure. Some unsubstantiated claims suggest foul play, rumors of romantic entanglements, a jealous husband, even a gunshot. But there was no formal inquest, no medical examination. Caldwell was far from home when he died, and his body was recovered and returned to Hartford without the kind of investigation that might have provided answers. What we know for certain is this: Elizabeth Colt's last surviving child was gone. She was 67 years old. She had outlived her husband. She had outlived all 5 of her children. She was alone. And she had 11 more years to live. Imagine that. 11 years inside Armsmear. 11 years managing a company built by a dead husband. 11 years attending charity events and suffragette meetings and church services while knowing that every single person you brought into the world is buried in Cedar Hill Cemetery. Did she rage? Did she weep? Did she simply carry on, as Gilded Age propriety demanded, with quiet dignity and no public acknowledgement of the unbearable weight? We don't know. What we do know is that she continued to work. She remained involved in the company's operations until 1901, when she finally sold her interest in Colt's manufacturing company. She was 75 years old. And then, in 1905, she drafted her will. Armsmear would not remain a family estate. With no heirs, there was no point. Instead, Elizabeth directed that the mansion be converted into a home for the widows and orphans of Episcopal clergy and other refined and educated gentlewomen. It was an extraordinary act of philanthropy. Or perhaps it was something else. Perhaps she couldn't bear the thought of the mansion sitting empty, or being sold to strangers, or becoming a museum dedicated to a man whose genius had brought her nothing but grief. So she gave it away, not to the workers who built the fortune, not to the city that benefited from Colt's factories and utilities, but to widows like herself, women who had lost their husbands, who understood grief, who needed refuge. On August 23rd, 1905, Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt died at age 78. She was buried at Cedar Hill Cemetery alongside Samuel Caldwell and her 4 children who died in infancy and early childhood. The Colt family line, through Samuel at least, ended with her. And Armsmear became something new. In 1911, architect Benjamin Wister Morris renovated the mansion according to Elizabeth's will. The elaborate OG dome was removed, the greenhouses were dismantled, the ballrooms were divided into apartments. 51 units, small, modest, designed for elderly women on limited incomes. The mansion that once housed one of America's wealthiest families now houses women who have lost everything. It's poetic in a way. Or perhaps it's just ironic. Because Armsmear was always a monument to loss. Loss of children, loss of health, loss of husbands, loss of the illusion that wealth can protect you from suffering. Samuel Colt died believing he had built an empire that would last generations. But his empire ended with his widow's death. The company continued. It still exists today, now owned by a Czech holding company. But the Colt family no longer controls it. The mansion still stands, of course. It's a National Historic Landmark. Tourists can glimpse it from the street, though it's not open to the public. The women who live there deserve privacy. And the factory? The factory still dominates the skyline. The Blue Onion Dome was restored in the 1990s. The complex is part of the Coltsville Historic District, and efforts are underway to fully develop it into a national historical park. Visitors will come. They will learn about innovation. They will marvel at the architecture. They will take photos of the dome. And they will leave without ever knowing about Michael Brennan, or the workers who struck in 1901, 1912, 1915, 1916, and 1918. Or the men who lost fingers to machines, or the women who were hired to replace striking workers at lower wages. They will leave without knowing about the Grove of Graves, or the 4 children who died before their 5th birthdays, or the widow who lived for 43 years in a mansion built for a family that fate refused to allow. They will leave without knowing the cost, because monuments don't commemorate cost. They commemorate triumph. And Armsmear, elegant, carefully curated, preserved by Elizabeth's final act of generosity, is a monument to a triumph that never quite materialized. Samuel Colt built an empire, but he couldn't build a family. And the mansion that watched it all knows the difference. January 10th, 1862. Hartford, Connecticut. A man died of gout at 47 years old, and the mansion on the hill kept watching. Today, if you visit Coltsville, you can stand on Wethersfield Avenue and look up at Armsmear. It's pale pink now, softened by time and renovations. The elaborate dome that once mirrored the factory's blue dome is gone. The greenhouses have been dismantled. The deer park and lagoons are now part of Colt Park, a public space donated by Elizabeth in her will. But the mansion itself remains. Inside, 51 elderly women live quiet lives. They walk through hallways where Samuel Colt once entertained senators. They sleep in rooms where Elizabeth raised the only child who survived infancy. They look out windows that once overlooked an industrial empire. And they probably have no idea. No idea that the building was purchased with money earned from revolvers. No idea about the grove of graves that once marked the lawn. No idea that the woman who donated this refuge outlived all 5 of her children. Perhaps that's for the best. Or perhaps it's the final erasure in a story full of erasures. Compare Samuel Colt to his contemporaries, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, all Gilded Age industrialists, all ruthless capitalists who built massive fortunes on the backs of workers. But Carnegie donated libraries, Rockefeller founded universities, Vanderbilt endowed educational institutions. They bought redemption with philanthropy. Colt died too young for redemption. He left $15 million, equivalent to $472 million today. But he didn't live long enough to become a philanthropist. He didn't build libraries across the country. He didn't endow universities. He built a factory, a dike, and a mansion. Elizabeth tried. She donated land for Colt Park. She funded charities. She organized the first suffragette convention in Connecticut. She commissioned a church and converted her mansion into a home for widows. But can philanthropy erase exploitation? Can charity absolve the sins of a system built on interchangeable workers treated as interchangeable parts? Museums don't ask these questions. They celebrate innovation. They marvel at the blue dome. They tell stories about progressive 10-hour workdays and factory libraries and social halls. They show you the mansion. They don't tell you about the graves. Here's what survives today. Armsmear stands as a retirement home. The factory stands as a national historic landmark. The Church of the Good Shepherd stands with its marble guns. Colt Park provides recreation for Hartford residents. The Wadsworth Athenaeum houses the art Elizabeth donated. Samuel Colt's name endures. His revolvers are collector's items worth millions. Biographies are published regularly. The company still produces firearms under the Colt brand. And the workers? Michael Brennan, if he existed, left no legacy. No buildings bear his name. No parks commemorate his labor. No museums tell his story. He was erased. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but systematically. Because history is written by those with the power to commission monuments, and workers don't commission monuments. Owners do. This is the legacy of Armsmear. Not innovation, not genius, not the perfection of interchangeable parts or the triumph of mass production. The legacy is this: some lives are remembered, others are erased, and the difference has nothing to do with merit or contribution. It has to do with power. Samuel Colt had power. Elizabeth had power. They used that power to build, to control, to shape narratives. And when they died, their power was preserved in stone, in institutions, in names on buildings. Michael Brennan had labor, he had skill. He had hands that assembled the revolvers that won the West. But labor, no matter how essential, doesn't build monuments. Capital does. And so we arrive at the question the mansion has been asking since the beginning. What is the cost of empire? Not the financial cost, not the engineering challenges, not the innovations required, the human cost. 4 children dead before their 5th birthdays. A widow living alone in a mansion for 43 years. Workers striking for recognition and dignity. Men losing fingers to machines. Women hired at lower wages to replace striking men. Families receiving no compensation when industrial accidents killed their breadwinners. That is the cost, and it is almost never mentioned. Because to mention it would complicate the story. It would force us to ask whether the revolver that won the West was worth the lives lost in its production. It would force us to ask whether innovation justifies exploitation. It would force us to ask whether we are still building empires the same way, celebrating genius while erasing labor. The mansion knows the answer. It has known since January 10th, 1862. When Samuel Colt died, 1,500 workers marched in his funeral procession. They stood in pairs, forming an honor line from Armsmear to the Grove of Graves. The Armory Band played. The Connecticut 12th Regiment, Company A, attended in full uniform. It was a spectacle befitting an emperor. But here's what the mansion saw that day. Workers mourning a man who fired them for tardiness, for shoddy work, for suggesting improvements. Workers mourning a man who built them housing, but refused to recognize their union. Workers mourning a man who paid them $2.50 a day while spending millions on greenhouses for orchids. Were they mourning, or were they performing? We don't know. But the mansion knows this. Empires demand loyalty, even from those they exploit. And loyalty, when demanded rather than earned, is just another form of control. So the mansion watches still. It watches as tourists photograph the Blue Dome. It watches as historians write about innovation. It watches as museums curate exhibits celebrating Colt's genius. It watches as Michael Brennan's name is forgotten. And it asks the question one final time. What is remembered? What is erased? And who decides?